Spices are so ubiquitous now that we often take them for granted. We use them to flavor our foods, preserve them, and make them look prettier. But did you know that there was a time when spices were more valuable than gold? That's right. There was a time when spices were considered the most precious commodities in the world, and this had a massive impact on history, sparked wars, shaped economies, and even led to the discovery of new lands. So let's take a journey back in time and find out how these humble little things took over the world. The demand for spices started thousands of years ago in ancient China and India, where they were used not just for their flavor, but also for their medicinal properties. The invention of paper is even attributed to a Chinese emperor who wanted to record his experiments with different recipes. During this time, the most important spices were black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. These spices were so valuable that they were often used as a form of currency. And if that's not enough to show how much they were valued, then I don't know what is. But the problem was that these spices were only produced in small quantities in distant lands, which made them incredibly hard to get. This led to an ancient trade route being established between China and Europe known as the Silk Road. It was called this because silk was one of the main commodities being traded along with spices. Tea and porcelain from the east, and gold, silver and ivory from the west. However, while the Silk Road was famous for its role in spreading Buddhism, it wasn't really a single road. Rather, it was a network of roads and trading posts that stretched over 4,000 miles across Central Asia. Traveling along the Silk Road was fraught with danger. Traders had to brave harsh weather conditions, bandits, and wild animals. But the risks were worth it because the rewards were just so great. By the Middle Ages, the demand for spices in Europe was at an all-time high. Everyone wanted to add a little bit of luxury to their lives, and what better way to do that than with some exotic spices from the East? This led to the rise of merchant classes in many European cities. The wealth that these traders generated helped to finance the Crusades and the construction of many magnificent cathedrals and public buildings. But this era of prosperity came to an abrupt end, when the Black Death swept through Europe and killed millions of people. For a while, no one cared about spices. People just wanted to survive. However, as the 14th century wore on, the desire for luxury goods began to return. This set the stage for the next great age of spice trading, the Age of Exploration. This was a period in European history when countries began to explore and conquer the world in order to find new sources of wealth. Portugal, Spain, France, and Britain all sent out explorers to find new routes to the east. They wanted to get there quicker and avoid the long and dangerous journey over land. In 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa. This discovery opened up the Indian Ocean trade routes to Europeans and gave them direct access to the spices they so desired. Soon after, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas in 1492. While he was actually trying to reach Asia, he didn't realize it at the time. But this would soon lead to the Spanish establishing settlements in the Caribbean and beginning the conquest of Central and South America. As the 16th century progressed, more and more Europeans began to pour into Asia to try and get their hands on the lucrative spice trade. The Portuguese were the first to arrive in force, followed by the Dutch and then the British. The Dutch East India Company was formed in 1602 and quickly became one of the most powerful economic forces in the world. It had a monopoly on the spice trade and amassed huge amounts of wealth. The company ruled over the Spice Islands with an iron fist and brutally suppressed any rebellions. In the early 17th century, the British began to challenge the Dutch for control of the spice trade. They had their own East India Company, which was formed in 1600 and was equally ruthless in its pursuit of power. The competition between the two companies was so intense that they often resorted to underhanded tactics to get ahead. They would bribe officials, start false rumors, and even engage in outright warfare. The struggle for supremacy between the British and Dutch would eventually lead to the colonization of large parts of Asia and Africa. The Europeans were determined to have these resources for themselves and wouldn't settle for anything less. This period of time has been dubbed the Spice Race, or sometimes the Cinnamon Wars, and it really shows us just how valuable spices were to the European powers. They would fight bloody wars and colonize entire continents just to get their hands on these precious spices. Now, before we move on, I want to tell you about something really cool. I've recently started posting early access versions of my videos on a website. You can watch the videos before anyone else, and you can also give me feedback. The link is in the description below if you're interested. Now back to the video. The first Europeans to put down roots in Asia were the Portuguese. They established trading posts and settlements all over the place, from India to China to Japan. The Portuguese were able to gain a foothold in many places because of their superior technology. They had bigger and better ships than the other Europeans, and also had firearms. This gave them an edge in trading and fighting battles with other powers. However, the Portuguese were eventually pushed out by the Dutch and the British. As I mentioned earlier, the Dutch East India Company was formed in 1602 and quickly became the dominant force in Asia. The British followed suit, and the two companies fought bitterly for control of the spice trade. In the end, the British won out and controlled most of India by the mid-19th century. While the British and Dutch were fighting over spices in Asia, the Spanish and Portuguese were doing the same thing in the Americas. The Spanish had discovered the Caribbean islands first and quickly began exploiting them for their natural resources, including wood for shipbuilding and sugar for making sweets. The Portuguese followed soon after and set up plantations of their own. This led to the enslavement of many indigenous people who were forced to work on the plantations. The Europeans also brought African slaves over to the Americas to work on the plantations, and this would have a lasting impact on the demographics of the region. As the centuries passed, the spice trade began to decline. In the 19th century, spices could be grown in large quantities in Europe. This made them much more affordable and accessible to the average person. By the 20th century, spices were no longer a luxury good and were used by everyone from poor peasants to rich kings. The impact of the spice trade on history cannot be overstated. It led to the age of exploration, the colonization of large parts of Asia and the Americas, and the enslavement of millions of people. The spice trade also had a major impact on the economy. It helped to finance the Crusades and the construction of many magnificent buildings in Europe. And it also led to the creation of some of the first multinational corporations, like the Dutch East India Company. If you're interested in learning more about the spice trade, I highly recommend checking out a book called The Spice Trader by John Key. It's a really well-written book that tells the story of the spice trade from start to finish. It covers everything from the ancient origins of the trade to its impact on the modern world. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe for more content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.